On February 5th, 2026, the Canadian government announced a comprehensive ban on imports of American agricultural products, automotive parts, and consumer electronics, effective immediately. The directive signed by Prime Minister Mark Carney represents the most aggressive trade action between the United States and Canada in over a century. It is not a tariff. It is not a quota. It is a full prohibition on hundreds of billions of dollars in annual trade. Within 72 hours of the announcement, shipping containers bound for Canadian ports were turned away. Trucks lined up at border crossings were denied entry. Distribution centers across Ontario and British Columbia began rationing American goods still in inventory. This is not a trade dispute. This is economic warfare between the two largest trading partners on Earth. The United States and Canada conduct approximately $900 billion in bilateral trade annually. That figure represents the most integrated economic relationship in the modern world. Supply chains for automobiles, aerospace, energy, and agriculture cross the border multiple times before final products reach consumers. A single car assembled in Michigan contains components manufactured in Ontario, shipped to Ohio for subassembly, returned to Canada for finishing, and then distributed across both nations. This system was built over decades through agreements that assumed mutual benefit, regulatory alignment, and political stability. That assumption no longer holds. The ban announced by Carney targets three sectors with surgical precision. American agricultural exports to Canada, worth approximately $28 billion annually, are now prohibited. That includes wheat, corn, soybeans, beef, pork, and dairy products. Automotive parts, a $75 billion category that keeps assembly lines running on both sides of the border, are blocked. And consumer electronics, including semiconductors, smartphones, and computing equipment manufactured in the United States or assembled by American companies, are no longer permitted entry. Together, these categories represent nearly $120 billion in annual exports. That is 1.3% of U.S. GDP, and it vanished in a single policy announcement. The immediate trigger was President Trump's decision on January 25th to impose 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods entering the United States. That threat was issued publicly during a press conference, framed as a response to Canada's pursuit of trade agreements with China that Trump described as backdoor circumvention of American interests. Carney had traveled to Davos and delivered a speech declaring that Canada would no longer accept being treated as a subordinate partner in North American trade. He stated clearly that Canada would pursue its own economic relationships with China, Europe, and other trading blocs, regardless of American objections. Trump responded with the tariff threat. Carney responded with a ban. But this escalation did not begin in January. It has been building for months, rooted in the renegotiation of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the trade deal that replaced NAFTA in 2020. The USMCA includes a mandatory review clause scheduled for July 2026. That review was designed to assess whether the agreement was functioning as intended and whether adjustments were needed. It was supposed to be a routine diplomatic exercise. Instead, it became a leverage point. Trump began demanding concessions months before the review was scheduled, insisting that Canada limit its trade with China, increase purchases of American natural gas, and accept new restrictions on immigration enforcement at the northern border. Canada refused. Carney, who took office in late 2025 after a campaign that explicitly rejected subservience to American demands, made clear that Canada would not renegotiate under coercion. He pointed out that the USMCA was signed just 6 years ago, that it was negotiated under Trump's first administration, and that Canada had already made substantial concessions during that process. Reopening the agreement now, before the scheduled review, would signal to every future negotiating partner that Canada's commitments are negotiable whenever Washington applies pressure. Carney calculated that standing firm would cost less in the long run than capitulating repeatedly. The Trump administration interpreted this refusal as defiance. In December 2025, reports emerged that the White House was preparing executive orders to impose tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, citing national security concerns under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act. That same legal mechanism was used during Trump's first term to justify tariffs on allies. Canada responded by threatening countermeasures on American agricultural products. The situation escalated from there. Threats became policies. Policies became bans. And now, two nations that share the longest undefended border in the world, that fought side by side in every major conflict of the 20th century, that built an economic union deeper than the European Union in many sectors, are locked in a trade war that neither side appears willing or able to de-escalate. The economic consequences are immediate and severe. American farmers are facing the loss of their second largest export market. Canada imports more American agricultural products than any country except China. Wheat farmers in North Dakota and Montana, corn producers in Iowa and Illinois, cattle ranchers across the Great Plains, all are now cut off from a market that absorbs roughly 18% of total U.S. agricultural exports. Prices are already falling. Farmers cannot simply redirect their products to other markets on short notice. Global commodity markets are not infinitely elastic. If Canadian buyers disappear, American producers either sell at steep discounts elsewhere, absorb storage costs while waiting for demand, or let crops rot in the field. The automotive sector is even more exposed. The North American auto industry is not organized by country. It is organized by integrated supply chains, where vehicles are assembled from components manufactured across all three USMCA nations. A ban on American automotive parts means Canadian assembly plants cannot operate. But it also means American assembly plants cannot operate, because many of the parts they need are manufactured in Canada and then returned to the United States for final assembly. Ford's Michigan assembly plant sources transmissions from a facility in Windsor, Ontario. General Motors' Arlington assembly in Texas depends on engines built in Ontario. Stellantis operates plants on both sides of the border that function as a single production system. Within a week of the ban, production slowdowns were reported at facilities in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. Parts shortages forced temporary shutdowns. Workers were sent home. The United Auto Workers Union, which represents employees on both sides of the border, issued a statement condemning both governments for using workers as collateral damage in a political fight. Automotive executives warned that prolonged disruption could force permanent closures and relocation of production to Mexico or overseas, where supply chains are less dependent on cross-border coordination. The electronics sector is facing similar paralysis. Canada is a significant importer of American semiconductors, telecommunications equipment, and computing hardware. Companies like Intel, Qualcomm, and Cisco generate billions in annual revenue from Canadian buyers, including government agencies, telecommunications firms, and enterprise customers. Those sales are now frozen. Canadian companies are scrambling to source alternatives from Asian and European suppliers. American manufacturers are watching revenue projections collapse and preparing for layoffs. But the pain is not one-sided. Canada is also absorbing significant economic damage. The ban cuts off Canadian consumers and businesses from products they depend on. Grocery prices are rising as Canadian retailers lose access to affordable American produce. Meat prices have spiked. Canadian auto manufacturers are facing the same production shutdowns as their American counterparts because the supply chains are shared. Electronics shortages are beginning to appear as inventory runs low. The Canadian dollar has weakened against the US dollar, making imports from other countries more expensive and driving inflation higher. Carney's government is betting that Canada can endure this pain longer than the United States can. The calculation is political as much as economic. Canada's population is 40 million. The United States is 340 million. In absolute terms, the U.S. economy is nearly 10 times larger. But in relative terms, Canada is more vulnerable because trade with the United States represents a larger share of its GDP. Canadian exports to the U.S. account for roughly 20% of Canadian GDP. American exports to Canada represent about 1.5% of U.S. GDP. By that measure, Canada has more to lose. But Carney is wagering that concentrated economic pain in key American states, particularly swing states with significant agricultural and manufacturing sectors, will generate political pressure on Trump to back down. The political dynamics are complex. Trump's core supporters include farmers, manufacturing workers, and rural voters who are now directly harmed by the loss of Canadian markets. Republican senators from agricultural states are receiving calls from constituents facing financial ruin. Industry groups are lobbying furiously for a resolution. But Trump has framed the dispute in nationalist terms, arguing that Canada is undermining American sovereignty by pursuing independent trade relationships with China. He has claimed that any concession to Canada would signal weakness and invite further challenges from other trading partners. His base responds to that framing. Polls show that Republican voters broadly support taking a hard line with Canada, even if it means short-term economic pain. Carney faces a similar political calculation. Canadian voters broadly support his stance. There is deep resentment across Canada over what is perceived as bullying by the Trump administration. The threat to impose 100% tariffs, the demands to renegotiate an agreement that is only 6 years old, the insistence that Canada subordinate its trade policy to American preferences, all of this has unified Canadian public opinion in a way that transcends party lines. Even opposition parties that normally criticize Carney have endorsed his refusal to capitulate. The political risk for Carney is not that Canadians will blame him for the trade war. The risk is that if he backs down, he will be seen as weak, and his government will lose credibility. This creates a classic escalation trap. Both leaders have staked their political reputations on not backing down. Both have domestic constituencies that support confrontation. Both face political costs if they are seen as capitulating. And neither has a clear path to de-escalation that does not require accepting terms the other side has already rejected. The result is a standoff where economic damage accumulates, political positions harden, and the structural incentives all point toward continued escalation rather than resolution. The situation is compounded by the fact that this is not happening in isolation. The U.S.-Canada trade war is unfolding at the same time as escalating tensions with China, threats of military action against Iran, unresolved disputes with European allies over NATO burden sharing, and the fallout from the Venezuela operation. American foreign policy is simultaneously confrontational on multiple fronts. Each individual conflict might be manageable, but the cumulative effect is to create doubt among allies about the reliability of American partnership and to provide openings for competitors like China to expand their influence. China has already moved to exploit the U.S.-Canada rift. Within 48 hours of Carney's ban announcement, Chinese officials contacted the Canadian government to propose expanded trade in agricultural products and automotive parts. China offered to increase imports of Canadian wheat, canola, and pork to offset the loss of American markets. They proposed joint ventures in electric vehicle manufacturing that would reduce Canadian dependence on American supply chains. They dangled access to Chinese consumer markets for Canadian goods. These offers come with strings attached. China wants Canada to limit its cooperation with American intelligence agencies, to adopt a more neutral stance on Taiwan, and to provide Beijing with access to Canadian critical minerals and rare earth deposits. Carney has not accepted these offers outright, but he has not rejected them either. He has stated publicly that Canada will pursue its economic interests with all willing partners. That language is deliberately ambiguous. It signals openness to Chinese engagement without fully committing to a reorientation of Canadian foreign policy. But the mere fact that these conversations are happening represents a significant shift. For decades, Canadian foreign policy has been anchored in the assumption that alignment with the United States is the foundation of Canadian security and prosperity. That assumption is now being questioned. Mexico is watching this closely. As the third member of the USMCA, Mexico benefits from stability and cooperation between the U.S. and Canada. A breakdown in that relationship threatens the entire North American trade architecture. Mexican officials have attempted to mediate, proposing trilateral talks to resolve the dispute before it spreads, but those efforts have gained no traction. Trump views the conflict as bilateral and refuses to involve Mexico. Carney has indicated he is willing to talk, but only if the United States withdraws the tariff threat first. Trump has refused to make the first move. The result is diplomatic paralysis. The European Union has issued statements expressing concern and urging both sides to return to negotiations. But Europe has its own trade disputes with the Trump administration and is reluctant to insert itself into a North American conflict where it has limited leverage. Japan and South Korea, both close allies of the United States and significant trading partners with Canada, have similarly stayed on the sidelines, unwilling to antagonize Washington, but also unwilling to endorse actions they view as destabilizing. The business community on both sides of the border is increasingly desperate. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Canadian Chamber of Commerce issued a rare joint statement calling the trade war economically catastrophic and politically reckless. They pointed out that millions of jobs depend on cross-border trade, that supply chains cannot be rebuilt quickly, and that the long-term damage to business confidence and investment will persist long after any agreement is reached. Industry-specific groups, from the American Farm Bureau to the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association, have echoed these warnings. But political leaders on both sides have calculated that the domestic political benefits of appearing tough outweigh the economic costs, at least in the short term. Financial markets have begun pricing in prolonged disruption. The Canadian dollar has fallen 8% against the US dollar since the ban was announced. Equity markets in both countries have declined, with particularly steep losses in sectors directly exposed to cross-border trade. Bond yields have risen as investors demand higher returns to compensate for increased risk. Analysts are revising growth forecasts downward for both economies. Goldman Sachs estimates that if the ban remains in place for 6 months, it could reduce U.S. GDP growth by 0.4 percentage points and Canadian GDP growth by 1.2 percentage points. Those figures may seem small, but they represent billions of dollars in lost output, tens of thousands of jobs, and measurable declines in living standards. The longer this continues, the harder it becomes to reverse. Companies that lose Canadian customers will not automatically regain them once restrictions are lifted. Canadian buyers who switch to Chinese or European suppliers may prefer those new relationships. Workers laid off during production shutdowns may find employment in other sectors and not return when plants reopen. Investment decisions deferred or relocated will not reverse simply because political leaders reach an agreement. Economic relationships, once broken, do not heal quickly or completely. There are potential off-ramps, but none are obvious or easy. Trump could withdraw the tariff threat and frame it as a tactical pause rather than a surrender. Carney could lift the ban while maintaining rhetorical opposition to American pressure. Both could agree to fast-track the USMCA review process and use that framework to address underlying disputes through negotiation rather than escalation. Mediators from Mexico, the United Nations, or the World Trade Organization could facilitate talks. But all of these options require both sides to step back simultaneously, and there is no indication that either leader is willing to make that move first. The alternative is that the ban remains in place, economic damage accumulates, and political pressure eventually forces one side or both to change course. But that process could take months. By that point, the damage will be substantial and in some cases permanent. Supply chains will have been reconfigured. Trade relationships will have been redirected. The trust and cooperation that made North American economic integration possible will have been eroded in ways that take years to rebuild. What is clear is that this is not a temporary disruption. This is a fundamental reevaluation of the U.S.-Canada relationship. Both countries are questioning assumptions that have guided policy for generations. The United States is questioning whether it can count on Canada to align with American strategic priorities, particularly regarding China. Canada is questioning whether alignment with the United States serves Canadian interests when it means accepting subordinate status and economic coercion. These are not questions that resolve quickly or easily. They represent structural tensions that will shape North American geopolitics for years, regardless of how the current crisis ends. The trade war between the United States and Canada is not an isolated incident. It is a symptom of a broader unraveling of the post-Cold War international order. The assumptions that govern trade, security, and diplomacy for 3 decades are breaking down. Alliances that seemed permanent are revealed as conditional. Economic integration that appeared irreversible is being torn apart by political decisions. And the institutions designed to manage disputes are proving unable to prevent escalation. The question is not whether this particular crisis will be resolved. The question is what comes after, and whether the damage being done now can ever be fully repaired.